Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 237, the 2025 and 2030 Dietary Guidelines, what they got right and where they fall short. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real World Nutrition. I am Shelly Rael, registered dietitian nutritionist, and today is part 3 of a series that I'm doing about the dietary guidelines for Americans. So just a quick recap of the last 2 episodes. In that first episode, that would be 235, I addressed what has stayed the same over time with the dietary guidelines since the first iteration in 1980 and the 5-year updates. And in the second episode, or episode 236, I addressed what has changed over these last 40 plus years and what that tells us about nutrition science. So today I want to put those pieces together and take a closer look at the most recent release of the dietary guidelines, or the most recent version, the 2025 to 2030 dietary guidelines. Now, these were released in January of 2026. So I want to talk about specifically what they got right and where they fall short, because both can be true at the same time. And I want to make it clear, this is a conversation, this is something that comes up every single time the dietary guidelines are released. So this isn't unique to this specific release. It just may seem like it because there's been a lot, or what feels like to me at least, a lot more talk about these dietary guidelines and those gaps. But I just want to say this is always something that dietitians specifically, we do get nitpicky about these things. So why does this matter? As I've said in past episodes, these are not meant to be individual recommendations, but overall patterns for larger purposes. So why this matters is because the dietary guidelines are there to shape school meals, influence the guidelines for WIC programs, military nutrition, hospital systems, and even the messaging that you see on food labels and in the media. Now, I don't want to take too much from what the media talks about. That's less what is the importance there. School meals, WIC programs, military nutrition, there are specific things that follow the dietary guidelines and it influences that. So whether somebody follows the dietary guidelines directly or not, it does still affect the food environment. And that's why I want to make it clear it's important to move away from extremes. So we don't want to blindly accept everything in the guidelines, but also we don't want to dismiss them entirely. I really want to put this into context and understanding them. And I will admit, not everybody looks at the nitty-gritty of these dietary guidelines. At least, I'm pretty sure they don't. And again, put this in context. So first, I want to talk about what the most recent version of the dietary guidelines got right. So what's going well, or what is being done well? Because there were, or are, I should say, several meaningful improvements. So first up, clearer messaging, I should say, about added sugars. So one of the biggest strengths, I would say, of this latest edition of the dietary guidelines is clearer messaging, clearer stance on added sugars. Now, the recommendation to limit added sugars to less than 10% of our total daily calories, this is not new. But the way it was presented in this most recent edition is definitely more direct. And there's also a stronger distinction between added sugars and naturally occurring sugars. And that matters because a lot of people don't know the distinction there. And I covered that in earlier episodes of this podcast on my blog in January 2026 when I did this series about carbohydrates. So you can go back and look at prior episodes about that. But this distinction between added sugars and naturally occurring sugars in the guidelines matters because Fruit is not the problem. Dairy is not the problem. And I see people going, I don't eat fruit because of all the sugar. I don't drink milk because of all the sugar. No, that is naturally occurring sugars. Added sugars, specifically in beverages, sugar-sweetened beverages, and highly processed foods are where most of the concerns lie. I think it's pretty obvious to people that sugars found in sodas, regular sodas, and snack foods, sweetened snack foods, are seen, it's so obvious. But when I have people tell me they're not eating carrots, they're not eating apples, they're not having 100% orange juice because of all the sugar, we've got to look at the bigger picture. Those foods, fruits, vegetables, orange juice, or I should say 100% fruit juice, yeah, it has sugar, naturally occurring sugar, and comes with a lot of other beneficial nutrients. So when we move away from labeling sugar as inherently bad and towards understanding how it fits into the overall diet and that distinction between the added and the naturally occurring sugars, that is important. And then another thing that they got right in this edition of the guidelines, is focusing on dietary patterns. So that's a big strength, is that continued shift towards overall patterns. And this is feeling like it's one of the more important changes in nutrition over the several past decades. Several decades. Because I say this all the time, health is not determined by one food. It's not determined by one nutrient. It's not determined by one single thing, but pattern over time, your overall pattern. So the guidelines emphasizing vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, lean proteins, and healthy fats, rather than saying low fat, low saturated fat, low sugar. It's the pattern, and it allows for flexibility. Because I say this, I don't know if I've said it in a while. We don't eat nutrients in isolation. We eat meals, we eat food. We have a bigger package going on here. So to hyper focus on individual nutrients, it's not realistic. And focusing on the foods and the meal patterns is really a better approach, or better reflects real life, at least for most people. I know there are people out there who just get focused on all the data, and that's okay for some people. It's just, I just want to encourage people to live and not be so focused on these numbers here. Now, this latest edition of the Dietary Guidelines looks at a more nuanced view of processed food. So it takes a more balanced approach to food processing. Now, I want to make this clear. All foods are processed to some degree. All foods. Washing, cutting, freezing, milling. That's all processing. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. I am so grateful that when I purchase my meat, it has already been processed for me. I do not want to go from the cow to the table. I don't want to deal with that processing in between. I outsource that. And you can judge me for that. But, again, foods are processed. The focus here with these guidelines are limiting ultra-processed foods that are high in added sugars, sodium, and refined ingredients. So not avoiding processed altogether, but being distinct about, we're talking about certain types of processed foods, and then we're talking about ultra-processed foods, which doesn't have a definition yet. But that distinction is important because we want to be realistic in the messaging. Now, a couple more things here that the new guidelines got right. Stronger emphasis on fiber. So fiber is finally getting the attention it deserves. And as I've said, I did episode Fiber 101 in the last 10 episodes. I think it was 10 or 15 episodes. So again, I'm not going to link all these in the show notes because it'd be ridiculous. But fiber, people just are not getting enough. So the guidelines, the new dietary guidelines, clearly emphasize fiber-rich foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. So this is one of the areas where the gap is vast. There's a wide gap here between what the recommendations are and the actual intake we consume as a population. So the highlighting of fiber is evidence-based and just a practical thing that we need to keep getting the message out from that. Now, another positive shift here is in the guidelines was a continued emphasis on life stage nutrition. So nutrition needs are not the same across the lifespan. Infants, children, adults, older adults, we all have different needs in those different stages of life. Pregnancy, lactation, different nutrition needs. So the guidelines are recognizing this more so now, and it's more aligned with human biology. So up until I believe it was the 2020 guidelines, the dietary guidelines were for individuals ages 2 and up. And in the last 10 years or so, like I said, I'm pretty sure it was the 2020 guidelines. It might have been the ones before that. We did start addressing infants and other aspects of that. So this is still relatively new when talking about life stage nutrition. So that's where things are great. The guidelines got these right, so to speak. But I do want to address where the guidelines did fall short. And this is where things do get a little bit more complicated, because there are areas where the guidelines oversimplify, or this is the bigger part, create some confusion. So having a recommendation about saturated fat without context. So the guidelines saying we want to limit or recommend limiting saturated fat to less than 10% of total calories. That's been consistent. But the context here is what's been missing. The impact of saturated fats depends heavily on what is replacing it. So if we're asking or recommending people limit their saturated fat, but we don't give them an alternative here, and the evidence-based alternative, the messaging gets lost here. So replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats has deep evidence-based benefits. So it's not reducing fat or just reducing saturated fat, reducing saturated fat. It's flipping the types of fat, exchanging those saturated fats with the unsaturated fats or the liquid fats, not replacing it with refined carbohydrates, which was a mistake of the late 80s, 90s, where people were going low fat and the added sugars were put in their place. So things were fat free, but they were still loaded with refined carbohydrates. That was not helpful. So emphasizing that distinction of minimizing, reducing saturated fat, but replacing it with the unsaturated fats. And without that distinction, the message can be too simplistic, or people will focus on cutting the saturated fat without looking at what is taking the place. And then confusion around dairy fat. So the inclusion of whole milk and full fat dairy, as the latest guidelines said, has created some mixed messaging. So I want to make it clear. These foods, whole milk and full fat dairy, can fit into a balanced diet. They can. But they do contribute more saturated fat. The only difference between whole milk and fat-free milk is the fat content, which is primarily saturated fat. So lower fat options can provide all the same key nutrients, the potassium and the calcium and the vitamin D. But when we have these lower fat options with less saturated fat, how do we get that to also fall in line with that less than 10%? So that less than 10% of saturated fat. So this becomes a question of how does everything fit together within the overall pattern? And that's not always clearly explained. So the mixed messaging here on the fats in these latest edition of the guidelines was the inconsistency of how the fats are discussed. So the guidelines recommend unsaturated fats like olive oil, nuts, and seeds. But then they also include foods like butter and beef tallow in the same conversation, the same phrasing, the same recommendation. And these are not equivalent in terms of their fatty acid composition or the evidence-based health outcomes. So saying we need to limit or limit our saturated fat to less than 10% but then also saying have these high saturated fat foods, it lacks clarity. It makes it harder for people to interpret the guidance. And I want to go back to, this is for school lunch programs and WIC. So this is a little bit more complicated than what people might realize for us behind the scenes. When we're implementing this in school lunch programs, this makes a huge, huge difference. So we add whole milk, we have to have it still be less than 10% of saturated fat. We've got to cut something out here. So that's a whole other conversation there. You don't need to worry about the school lunch program. That was just an example. And then additives and avoid language. So the dietary guidelines here, this was some language here around additives. So there's a recommendation to avoid certain ingredients like artificial dyes or preservatives. There's not strong evidence that that's going to make a meaningful difference in overall nutrition. And some additives, they do have some limited or mixed data at typical intake levels. But also I remind people, what types of foods are those artificial dyes in? They're not in the fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, beans, seeds, legumes, dairy foods. So this whole using a blanket statement, avoid artificial dyes or preservatives, creates unnecessary fear. Yeah, we can certainly go with foods that have high amounts of preservatives and artificial dyes, but that takes away the shift from the overall dietary pattern. If the overall dietary pattern is good, is it a problem if somebody has M&Ms that have those dyes in it? Because whether or not a food contains artificial dyes, it really needs to take into consideration how often it's consumed. And Skittles and Fruit Loops have really been beaten up in these conversations. But if I'm having Skittles only right around Halloween and we're talking like 3 mini bags, is that a big deal? Or if it's like the bulk of my diet is Kool-Aid and blue Gatorade and all these colorful candies and treats, that's a big difference there. So again, overall patterns is where we need to look more, and that is where the guidelines don't pay attention to that. And then with the sugar and the sweetener language, there's a shift to more absolute language in this recommendation here when it comes to added sugars and non-nutritive sweeteners. So the guidelines, I should say, have moved from limit or moderate, so limit added sugars to less than 10% or moderate amounts, to just outright saying avoid non-nutritive sweeteners, avoid added sugars. And that may sound stronger, but that's not helpful. That can backfire. People can choose what they want to do. But if there's this guilt related to no added sugars or don't use the artificial sweeteners, all or nothing messaging tends to reduce adherence. So think about this. And I've said this, it's been a while since I've said this. As soon as human beings, as soon as we're told not to have something, avoid something, don't do it, we want to do it. The brain triggers that. Like, don't you tell me what I can and can't do. Now, obviously, nobody's like going to smack sugar out of your hand or smack the Splenda packet out of your hand. But that still leads to all or nothing messaging where I have people say, you're not supposed to have that. And it's like, one, don't you dare tell me what I can't have. But it just doesn't, it's not helpful. People do better with flexibility rather than rules. Trust me, I've been doing this for a long time. When we say, yeah, it's okay to have chocolate, how often are you having it? That's the bigger issue. All right, and this was a big one. I wrote an entire blog post about this. Again, you can go back and look in the blog about in January of 2026 where I did this, is alcohol guidance. Now, the guidance in the most recent guidelines, the 2025, 2030 guidelines that I'm talking about, it changed. Prior guidelines gave specific limits. It was very specific. If someone does choose to consume alcohol, this is the recommendation to limit it. But now, the recommendation now just says limit. And it sounds reasonable. So what's the difference here? It lacks clarity. It did not include any specific definitions of anything here. It just said limit. And let me just tell you again, based on my experience, without specifics, people will interpret that differently. Some people say, okay, I'll limit to 3 drinks a night. Where other people are like limits, like, oh, I'll have 3 drinks a year. But without any recommendations or, again, evidence-based information, it becomes not helpful. So I'm going to talk more about this in an upcoming episode because alcohol consumption carries risk at any level. And again, clear guidance would be helpful here. I acknowledge people are not going to stop drinking just because now all of a sudden we have more evidence that the risk, the health risk is, it's just, I don't want to say unsafe. Alcohol carries risk at any level. And with that information, I've not met anybody who says, oh, now I'm going to stop drinking. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more in an upcoming episode. So again, clearer guidance here would be helpful. Now, where's the little differences here get lost? A lot of these issues come down to one thing, these nuances, these little details where, again, I say, remember the guidelines are for population level recommendations. It is meant to simplify complex science. We've got to get soundbite messaging. And sometimes that simplification removes some important context here, and that's where it's confusing for people. Again, if they actually pay attention to the guidelines. So what does this mean for you? What do you actually do with this? Well, here's some big takeaways. Focus on your overall dietary pattern rather than individual foods and even individual nutrients. Include a variety of plant-based foods along with protein sources that work with you. If you consume animal products, include those protein sources. If you don't, include plant-based protein sources. But plant-based foods are good for everybody. That doesn't mean you have to go vegetarian. Just fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, beans, legumes. You get the picture there. Be mindful of added sugars, but remember it's not all or nothing. Nothing's going to happen if you have a cookie or a cupcake. Choose fats thoughtfully. Prioritize the unsaturated sources, so the ones that are liquid at room temperature, the unsaturated ones that are found in avocados and nuts and seeds. Those are better for us. Or I should say, unsaturated fats are healthier than saturated fats, generally speaking. And again, remember, nutrition science is not static. It evolves. As science evolves, we can come back in 5 years and say, hey, we've learned more here. We're going to adjust things. That's what I addressed in last week's episode. So with that, I want to say, again, this most recent edition of the Dietary Guidelines aren't perfect. They're not meant to be. It's a combination of science, policy, and practicality. Like, what are people going to actually do? There is progress, but there's always limitations. There's always something, like I said, we find that could have been better. We prefer something would have been better. But look, both matter. It's progress, but we have to recognize the limitation. It allows us to make better decisions and be informed and have a better conversation on that. All right. So just want to say that's the goal of this series. I'm going to keep talking about this and some of these little details here that, again, you may not care about on a day-to-day basis, but if it comes up in conversations or you're like, hey, I never really thought of it that way, that's why I'm here to help. All right. With that, I want to thank you for listening to this series. If you found this helpful, follow, share, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Forward this to anybody. Heck, and you can reach out to me. My contact information is in the show notes, and you can always go to ShellyRyell.com and find all kinds of information on how to reach out to me. And with that, I will wrap up this episode. Until next week, take care and bye for now.